guess we are online now. So good afternoon to all our viewers. Good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome to the second Eurogypsum webinar, which will be dedicated to biodiversity in quarries, dynamic ecosystems for dynamic economies. And this online event is organized with the support of Ruud Pedersen. I'm Tristan Suffis, I'm the Secretary General of Eurogypsum. We are an association representing the gypsum, plasterboard product sector. Our members process a recyclable raw material, gypsum, into lightweight products, which are incorporated into walls, ceilings, and other systems for buildings. They protect homes, offices from fire, they maintain good temperatures, healthy indoor air, they protect us from our neighbors' noise, and they make our living spaces and working spaces flexible and adaptable. So we represent products that are mainly applied indoors. In times of COVID, we've spent much time indoors and we've enjoyed having energy efficient, comfortable homes. But let's go outside today, at least virtually, move up the production chain into the supply of raw materials. Whether on the ground, in quarries, or underground, in mines, we would often consider extraction sites as a dead zone, a wound on the Earth's skin. But the reality is not so simple. Sustainability and biodiversity interact with raw material supply in such ways that we would not necessarily imagine. So the purpose of today's webinar is to look at quarries as a place where the imperative of protecting our ecosystems meets the needs of modern and sustainable economies, and to look at how both objectives can match. So I'm very pleased to have distinguished speakers with us today who can contribute their experience from various angles. So we have Maria Newberg, you're a policy officer at the European Commission's DG GROW, where your focus is on supporting industrial competitiveness through access to sustainable raw materials. Hello, Maria. We have Przemysław Ogiński. You also work for the European Commission, but at DG Environment, where you've been busy with the EU 2030 biodiversity strategy, and in particular, the mining and nature interface. We have also Professor Grégory Mailly. You're a professor at Jean Blou Agrobiotech, a department of Liège University, and you're specialized in biodiversity, in particular, the interactions between biodiversity and human activities, such as agriculture, urban areas, or extractive sites, indeed. And we have Dave Kent. You're a mineral resources director for gypsum at Saint-Gobain, and you are also Eurogypsum's raw material committee chair. So a very warm welcome to our speakers and to everyone attending today's webinar or watching the video in the future. So we'll first hear from our speakers before having a panel discussion. Please send us your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of this window. So not the chat function, the Q&A function, and we'll take as many as possible at the end of the event. But first, let's try to understand the context we're facing on biodiversity and how Europe would like to address it. I'd like Przemysław to give us a short overview of the EU biodiversity strategy and help us understand its particular relevance for the raw materials supply sector. So Przemysław, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for the invitation to this very timely and interesting event. So I prepared a short PowerPoint presentation. I understand that it will be shared by the colleagues in the consultancy helping with this event.
Yes, that should be the case. Yeah, that's coming right now.
Okay, great. Again, my name is Przemysław Ogiński and I work in the nature unit in DG Environment, where I am responsible for the file of extractive industry and their interface with the nature and biodiversity policies of the European Union. Next slide, please. So, as you are probably aware, we are facing an unprecedented loss of our biodiversity, both on the global stage as well as in the European Union. Periodically, the European Commission monitors the state of our biodiversity in the EU on the basis of data that we get from the member states. And the last reporting cycle was for the period 2013-2016. And it resulted in the State of Nature report, which was published in 2019. And again, this report presented a very dire picture of our biodiversity. So as you can see from the graphs, only 15% of our habitats on the EU level are in favorable conservation status. All the other ones are in different stages of bad situation. And this is pretty much the condition of all main habitat types, including the habitat types that often occur in the mines or in the quarries, such as rocky habitats, grasslands, forests, dunes, and others. Next slide, please. The situation is similar with the species. On average, only less than 10% of our species show an increasing trend. Most of them show decreasing trends, or their condition is not fully known. Next slide, please. So what is the EU response to this dire situation? In 2019, the European Commission adopted the European Green Deal, part of it, which is the biodiversity strategy for 2030, which was adopted in May last year. So now I will briefly focus on the biodiversity strategy, particularly in the context of the mining sector. Next slide, please. So we have four main elements of EU biodiversity strategy, four main commitments. The first one is to protect nature. The second, to restore nature. There's also a commitment to enable transformative change. So mostly issues such as ensuring sufficient funding, but also enforcing the legal framework. And also a commitment to have an ambitious global agenda, particularly in relation to the global discussions on biodiversity, such as Convention on Biodiversity that will have its one of the main meetings later this year in China, where the commitments for the next 10 years are supposed to be adopted. But I will now briefly focus on these two first elements, so protection of nature and restoration of nature. The next slide, please. So as regards the protection of nature, the EU made the commitment to legally protect 30% of our land and marine areas, including ecological corridors. To strictly protect at least a third of this protected areas, including all of the old growth forest. And the third important commitment under this pillar is effective management of protected areas, including a definition of clear conservation objectives and measures. So obviously all of these elements are very important in relation to the mining activities, because many of them are carried out in the protected areas or outside the protected areas, but they can affect our nature. So particularly the commitment to effectively manage our protected areas and our natural development sites can have important repercussions for the mining sector. So it is very important for the mining sector to work together with the nature authorities on ensuring appropriate conservation objectives and measures. Next slide, please. There is also a big commitment in relation to restoration. The Commission proposed and the Member States endorsed the objective of having a legally binding instrument on restoration proposed in 2021. And the works on this instrument have just started. There is a commitment to ensure no deterioration of protected habitats and species by 2030, and to have at least a positive trend in relation to 40% of them. We also have a lot of important targets in relation to agriculture. It's maybe not so relevant for the mining sector, but it is important to note that there are important restoration objectives, for example, in relation to the use of landscape features, reduction of pollution, etc. There is also a very important commitment to plant 3 billion trees, reverse decline in pollinators, and restore 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers. Next slide, please. The mining sector and biodiversity. What is our perspective on these issues? So obviously, the mining sector and the resources producers is very important for reaching the objectives of European Green Deal and other policies, for example, in terms of renewables and other sectors. Obviously, we will not reach the objective of carbon neutrality by 2050 if we don't have access to the appropriate resources. So indeed, it is very important to ensure the resources to meet these objectives. But at the same time, the sector creates important threats and pressures to our biodiversity. So it has to be properly addressed. One of the ways of addressing this issue is ensuring the compliance with EU nature legislation, which, for example, requires that all the projects that can affect nature are subject to appropriate assessments of its impacts on Natura 2000. It also requires that species protection is ensured. As we know, our quarries in the EU are an important habitat for many protected species, including some of the pioneer species, which occur mostly in quarries. I know that the sector is working on improving its performance in relation to these issues, but I think still has to be done, and definitely some good practices in these areas should be shared. There's also important opportunities for restoration. As I mentioned, the Commission has made very important commitments in relation to restoration of our biodiversity in the next 10 years. And the mining sites, particularly the sites which are not in use anymore, they offer very important opportunity for restoration, and there is actually quite an interesting experience already for some of these sites. For example, lakes created in the mining sites which are not used anymore, even being designated as Natura 2000 sites. So there is a big room for the sector working together with the nature protection sector and authorities and NGOs and stakeholders to make sure that these areas contribute in an optimal way to nature protection and restoration. And I would like to finish my presentation by making a reference to a very interesting live project. I don't know if there are in the audience maybe some stakeholders involved in this project, and that would be a great opportunity actually to discuss with them how projects like this can contribute to nature restoration and protection. But yes, one of the EU funding instruments, so that the LIFE program is indeed funding very interesting measures, specifically in this case in Wallonia, to improve the nature management and protection in the quarries. And there are very interesting experience in this field, and I think they should be shared and promoted so that we could find win-win solutions both for nature protection and using our natural resources coming from mines and quarries. So that would be it from my side. I'm looking forward to having a discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Przemysław, for this good overview, and also for your call for solutions in the sector, giving us a good example of the life in quarries, which I think many of us have heard about or been involved in. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure many participants would have questions, but please save them or send them through the Q&A panel of this Zoom event, and we'll take them at the end of the event. So thank you again, Przemysław. And now turning to Professor Mahi, you're a recognized expert in biodiversity. We've just heard about the major challenge we're facing on this. To what extent is raw material sourcing a threat to biodiversity? Can extractive activities also provide a positive contribution to biodiversity? Can you enlighten us on this scientific, political, but also philosophical debate? Gregory, you have the floor. Thank you in advance for your thoughts.
You just need to activate the screen sharing for participants if possible.
So a message to our colleague in the back office, John.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
So I will try to provide a short overview on these very general questions. And just for information, indeed, we are partners of the Life in Quarries project. And I think that FEDEX is in the audience, certainly the coordinator of the project. So when we think about extractive industry, not we, but when the general public think about extractive industry, the general view will be more, I think, this view or this point of view, leading extractive activities leading from natural, lively, beautiful scenes to ugly paysage with high impacts on ecosystems. And my presentation is unfair on this point because I just compare a national park in the United States with a tropical situation, but it's very easy to represent an activity sectors, whatever, and specifically extractive industry as the bad guys in the sense of biodiversity. And so how can we move from this a bit caricatural situation and perception of the relationship between extractive activities and biodiversity? Well, the first thing is, it has just been said now in the first presentation, is to apply, I would say, the baselines for biodiversity preservation in any economic sector, and specifically extractive sectors with high impact on habitat. It's true, it's not simply a secret, and to apply at least and implement in its best way the avoid, minimize and restore, compensate sequence that is linked to environmental assessment. And this is mainly from minimizing impacts. And the question is whether and when, also in which condition, we can move from minimizing impact to net positive effect or net zero loss for biodiversity in relation to extractive activities. And so the first thing is certainly that extractive industry are already well engaged in this way. First, by developing strategy to minimize impact on natural high biological value ecosystem with the production of numerous and very clever good practice guidance for mining, biodiversity, mining industry, linked to biological value ecosystem or to specific taxonomic groups and protecting or promoting birds and butterflies, protected plants in the environmental sequence. The second point or the second point of the strategy where extractive industry are already very engaged in Europe is a restoration, post-extraction restoration of habitat, and mainly stable habitat, permanent habitat that will last for a long time in the future after exploitation. And so just like we can find in the Belgian quarries, restoring permanent ponds, a high value meadow, grassland, forest when it's possible, feasible, is more and more becoming a common practice in restoring and in post-exploitation rehabilitation. But restoration of stable habitats has present some limits. The first one is that during the exploitation phase, during the active phase of the quarry life cycle, restoration is limited in its surfaces and will mainly include the periphery of the quarries. So the visible impact and the impact of the extractive industry can still be high if we only focus on restoration of stable habitat during the life cycle of the quarries. And also we should be aware that in some cases, natural habitat, natural ecosystem are difficult, if not impossible, to restore in a timeline that is acceptable for human society. Just think about pristine forest, European pristine forest, or peatlands that develops over centuries or millennia. So restoration may have some limits, and in some situations, quarries are more than just linked to restoration. They can be a true opportunity to develop biodiversity, and it is specifically true in a human-dominated landscape, human homogeneous landscape that are the most widespread landscape in temperate Europe, in Western temperate Europe. In such landscape, extractive activities will provide a very interesting ecological condition. The first one is that it develops nutrient-poor soil and bare ground, which has become rare in our human-dominated landscape, but also perturbations that are induced by extractive industry create heterogeneity, diversity of condition, and dynamic environment, which are basically two conditions to maintain biodiversity at the landscape level. So by creating heterogeneity, an active quarries will lead to a patchwork of habitats, and as it has been underlined in the previous presentation, specifically habitats for pioneer and for pioneer species and species for temporary habitat that has become threatened in our human-dominated landscape, but also extractive activities that may seem very hard for the environment will also be the opportunity for dynamic of habitat, for dynamic ecological succession, moving from screw to pioneer grasslands, recolonizing forest, and in some case, mature forest. And so an important point is that the added value of quarries for biodiversity is certainly to be placed in a network strategy, in a network vision, because with dynamic environment, managing biodiversity in quarries in network allow to maintain the different stage of ecological succession and to maintain heterogeneity, ecological heterogeneity at the scale of a human-dominated landscape. But also active quarries can be an important contributor to ecological network, being core areas for specific species population or serving as stepping stones for other species population. Active quarries are certainly important to maintain and to promote biodiversity in human-dominated landscape. And the main question is, in active quarries, whether we will consider these two actors in conflict or as mutualistic actor of the same ecosystems. And I would just like to give some guidelines that we gained from the Life in Quarries project on how to move from a conflict to a mutualistic situation. And from our experience and from the philosophical point of view, perhaps, I think that the main point is people. It's just to move to the action plan for nature, people, and the economy from the European Commission, and to make people as the centerpiece of the biodiversity strategy, to connect the natural ecosystem to business ecosystem. And when I'm talking about people, I'm not talking only about general public, but mainly people within the business ecosystem, because the main challenge to promote biodiversity in quarries is to increase the autonomy of the sectors and the internalization of the process of managing biodiversity, to move from a situation where experts turn to economic sector to a situation where there is a both side dialogue and where the biodiversity, by contributing to the well-being of the business ecosystem, will also contribute to the economy and to the economic aspect of the extractive sector. And from our experience, we know that the quarrying sectors knows about biodiversity, is interested in biodiversity, is involved in its present preservation, even if in some point the term biodiversity may be half misunderstood by the actors. But the most important request from the sector is to be competent to manage biodiversity and not only to be informed. So the challenge is to promote internalization of the process by training, individual implication, and by including biodiversity in the environmental management system with user-friendly tools to increase the autonomy of the sectors. We try to do this, and it is a sharing of this experience of the Life in Quarries with specific action, training the different actors of the extractive sectors. As you say, with the aims to help the sector to monitor by itself biodiversity and to integrate biodiversity challenge in daily management practice and in all compartments of the structure. This means trainings of biodiversity manager. Most quarrying society has a very competent environmental manager, but we are still lacking a specific biodiversity manager with biodiversity competence. And it means we are training not only information. Here it's 4 days dedicated training with theory, practice, fields, learning how to make the monitoring, learning how to make an action plan for biodiversity, with a great success in Wallonia, because as we train more than 60 biodiversity manager across 40 quarries. It's also training, not only informing, but training directors, the top of the society, CEOs, site directors, so they know what is going on in the site, but also they know the challenge and they can integrate the challenge in their business ecosystems. And you need to use specific training session. You know, these are people with a lot of work and very important challenge. So very short focused session can be used for this. It's also training workers, people that are day to day in the quarries to implement the action. This is the important point. It is really the corner piece of the success of biodiversity management in quarries. People in the quarries should implement the action by themselves with their own competencies, their day-to-day competencies of their day-to-day job. This helped people to be involved in the monitoring and in taking care of biodiversity. And we can go a step further by providing tools and training to quarries sectors to monitor the biodiversity by itself, not only on the basis of expert judgment, but to be part of the monitoring, as you can see here in the quarries, in the Life in Quarries program, where workers and the site directors and biodiversity manager are involved in the monitoring. One important point is that biodiversity is a very complex subject with a lot of levels, species, habitat, landscape, genes, a different taxonomic group with different ecological requirements. So an important point, a central point, is to provide management and monitoring tools that can be used independently, that are user-friendly for the sector, and that will help the sectors to include biodiversity in its environmental management system, and not only as an external request from the society. And so the key message would be to move from biodiversity to biodiversity, people, and economy in extractive activities. Is certainly to clarify the links between business ecosystem and biodiversity, whether you have direct, indirect links, including ecosystem services. We not talk about this. To work with regional wealth network strategy that will provide added value, to identify values for biodiversity at all levels of the company to increase awareness, to consider also immaterial values of biodiversity, how biodiversity increase the well-being in the business ecosystem, and to make collaborators active actors of the biodiversity strategy. And the challenge, the true challenge now, is to integrate biodiversity in the environmental management system with appropriate tools to manage and monitor biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for this great presentation that shows us the diversity of biodiversity management and the challenges of integrating it by extractive industries. And also thank you for the plea to make people central in the process, managers, workers, etc. Again, to every attendant, don't hesitate to send us your questions via the Q&A panel, and we'll have the discussion right after the rest of the presentation. But looking now at this debate from the angle of material supply, we know how important it is for Europe and the European Green Deal's objectives to supply essential raw materials for batteries of electric vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure, and also for the renovation of our homes and other buildings to higher standards and better energy performance. How are biodiversity considerations and more generally sustainability concerns taken into account in Europe's raw material supply? Maria, you've been working on a set of principles regarding sustainable raw materials, involving various stakeholders in the debate. Can you present us this work and explain how sustainability can be properly integrated into supply security considerations? Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tristan. Could Ruud Petersen please open my presentation? Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take part in this event on biodiversity in quarries. So as Tristan mentioned, I will talk about the EU policy on securing sustainable raw materials. And specifically, I will talk about a set of EU principles for sustainable raw materials that are being finalized at this point in time. Next slide, please. We are committed to the Paris Agreement and the transition to climate neutrality. The European Green Deal is a vehicle for taking the lead in becoming a climate neutral continent based on sustainability, green energy, and circular economy. And this ambitious goal will require significant changes in our economies and supply chains. And this includes also the raw materials supply chains. We need to ensure a secure and sustainable supply of raw materials to meet the needs of clean and digital technologies, as Tristan just mentioned. And this is part of the industrial strategy of March last year, which is to be updated now in April, taking into account developments in the political context, including the pandemic. This secure and sustainable supply of raw materials will need to be addressed by rethinking the way we consume resources, becoming more circular, and ensuring that new extraction, mining, and refining activity is done as sustainably as possible. Slide number 3, please. The action plan on critical raw materials that we presented last September sets out concrete steps to achieve this. It presents 10 actions to develop resilient EU value chains, how to become more circular, how to do more sustainable sourcing and processing in the EU, and to diversify supply with sustainable and responsible sourcing from third countries. If you look closer at Action 10, promote responsible mining practices for critical raw materials, this will actually build on the set of EU principles for raw materials that I will get more into in a minute. The ambition of our industrial policy is to have an industry that creates value-added jobs in all regions across Europe, an industry that's driven by innovation, quality, respect for the environment, rather than by lowering labor costs. And batteries are a good illustration of this, with the creation of the European Battery Alliance and the action plan in 2018. And the good results at this stage are visible with investments in all segments of the battery value chain and in almost all member states. Slide number 4, please. And it is in this batteries action plan of a couple of years ago that the European Commission announced the intention to develop a set of EU principles for sustainable raw materials. That is when this work got started. The objective is to feed into an integrated approach to sustainable raw materials extraction and processing in Europe in terms of social, environmental, and economic governance performance. And the EU principles should align the understanding of sustainable raw materials extraction from exploration to post-closure and processing operations amongst member states, and define the general direction towards the sustainable development goals. The principles should enable to better communicate with the public on the conditions at which sustainable raw materials extraction and processing takes place in Europe, and increase public acceptance for this activity. And here I see a link to what Professor Mahi was just talking about earlier, on the need to build trust with stakeholders concerned, and the measures for increased understanding of these activities. Slide number 5, please. So who is doing this work? It is the European Commission expert group. The raw materials supply group has a kind of subgroup that is devoted to exchanging best practices on land use planning, permitting, and geological knowledge. And this group include member states, industry associations, research organizations, NGOs, social partners, and various director generals in the Commission besides DG GROW, where we are driving the process. And it is about reflecting the practices that are followed within the European Union and that are expected to be applied also by new entrants to the market. And these set of principles will be presented to the raw material supply group for adoption and endorsement by Q2 of this year, and will be published after this. So look out for it during Q2. Slide number 6, please. The scope of the EU principles stretches beyond battery raw materials to minerals as defined in the Extractive Waste Directive, and they are applicable to the extraction and processing stages of non-energy raw materials and to the entire minerals value chain's life cycle, from exploration to post-closure, as well as to the production of secondary raw materials from extractive waste streams such as waste rocks, processing waste, and tailings. Important. There are no, they do not bring with them any, they do not impose any obligations on member states or the industry than the already existing ones, and that the development of indicators and certification, it is outside the scope of this action. Next slide, please. So we have 8 principles in these 3 areas: social, economic governance, and environmental. And they build upon a list of the existing EU acquis, and that is to be found in Annex 1, that member states and companies should respect for sustainable raw materials extraction and processing. And the intention is also that they should add coherence amongst international agreed sustainable raw materials extraction and processing initiatives. We know that there are a host of them: the TSM, the OECD due diligence, the IRMA, ICMM, and so forth. But let's take a closer look at what the principles look like. So if you can take slide number 8, please, in the environmental area. This is principle number 6, and it reads: sustainable raw materials extraction and processing apply sound environmental management practices. It is ensured by, and then you can see in under bullets A to D how we go into a higher level of detail of how this environmental management practices are assured. We are running a little bit short of time, so I will not read them out to you, but I hope that Tristan can share the slides so you can see for yourself in detail how it is built up. And just to note here that for each of the principles, we are connecting them with the respective SDG that they refer to and link to. So that was the one example of the environmental principles. I believe that we will skip the other ones. We have also in the area of human rights engagement with community of interest, employment, health and safety. We will skip that. And we will also skip the one on economic and governance, business integrity, transparency, and wider economic contribution. So if Ruud Petersen could please turn to slide number 13. Thank you very much. And this shows the annex, and you will see that it gives it links to EU legislation and it clarifies the scope. And please note that this annex, it is an overview of relevant EU legislation, and that the exhaustive legal framework for mineral extraction and permitting procedures can be found in the MINLEX study, which we are also updating at this point in time. So finally, if you can take slide number 14, I'd like to draw your attention to that at a recent high-level meeting, it was the 12th of March European Battery Alliance ministerial meeting, there was a mentioning there that the Commission will publish a set of EU principles for sustainable raw materials and also launch a roundtable on environmentally and socially sustainable raw materials mining before summer. And the principles will be one element taken into account at this roundtable. You find it if you Google Shevkovich, 12th of March, and EBA, European Battery Alliance. And this announcement attaches increased attention to the EU principles for sustainable raw materials, which is relevant for their take-up and use. Just to say that I'd like to finish by thanking Eurogypsum for organizing today's event and giving me the opportunity to speak on securing access to sustainable raw materials and the set of principles in this context that we are developing on behalf of the European Commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this good example of a cross-stakeholder work, looking at many relevant aspects of raw material supply, and happy to share the slides, of course. Looking at practice, Dave Kent, would you like to briefly present some examples from European gypsum quarries to give us an idea of what it looks like I'm conscious of time, so if you could be very, very quick, Dave. Sorry for that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, Tristan. Yeah. Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Kent, and I'm proud to represent the European gypsum mining industry today. I'd like to share our thoughts on ecosystem management in raw material sourcing with some best practice examples from gypsum quarrying in Europe. Next slide, please, John. So I think it's important to state that we're not only talking about restoring of quarries here, we're also talking about dynamic management during the life of the quarry. And you'll see through the examples where we do this, we talk about the use of temporary nature, and I will discuss that later. Next slide, please, John. So the first example is in Markt Nordheim in Germany, in Bavaria, Germany. Next slide, please, John. So here, some of the actions undertaken in the quarry include the creation of a permanent wetland through soil compaction. Rock cliffs were constructed to create dry habitat for reptiles and other animals, and valuable grassland plant species were developed thanks to the sowing of hays. Because of this very, very successful initiative, the quarry has been added to the a larger flora and fauna habitat in the area. Next slide, please, John. We should also remember the socioeconomic impact of quarrying, and this is clear in this particular example where you'll see in the picture some cattle. These are a very old breed of cattle from the area, red yellow Franconian cattle that are now used to graze the quarry area. And the owners of this particular quarry have also taken the trouble to erect information panels around the quarries, because now it's part of the larger area. They do get tourists coming through. Next slide, please, John. I talked about temporary nature. We can see this here in this particular quarry, where we have an active mining area, extraction area, but we also have temporary biodiversity areas within the quarry. Now, it's important to remember that to do this, we need some good housekeeping rules to manage this particular process, including good management of overburden stocks and material, the eventual translocation of species, and firm rules regarding destruction of habitats during the breeding or hibernation season. But clearly, this particular example shows that this can work, this idea of temporary habitats, temporary nature. Next slide, please, John. The next example is in Puckberg and Schneeberg in Lower Austria. And here we have a gypsum quarry that's actually located in a Natura 2000 area. Next slide, please, John. Here, the recultivated, restored areas are designed based on the typical model of the landscape in the area, with small hills and dips. Each year, before new gypsum areas are excavated and extracted, the protected plants within the area are transplanted to already restored areas. In the last few years, dry grassland and fen have been transplanted, and in the near future, the company will transplant other types of grasslands. The result is very little difference between pre-quarrying landscape biodiversity and post-quarrying landscape biodiversity, which just goes to show that we can mine successfully within Natura 2000 areas. Next slide, please, John. Completely different landscape here. Sometimes gypsum soils are largely unsuitable for the growth of trees, and vegetation is generally composed of shrubs and annual plants in these areas. It can be an extremely adverse habitat for plant life, but can give rise to rare plants in dry and semi-dry regions. I think the key point here when we're looking at areas like this is that maintaining or restoring these habitats is to start work long before quarrying even begins. And I'll take you through this final example. Next one, John, please. Okay, so this third example is in Almeria in the south of Spain, and it shows efforts undertaken to not only address the visual impact, but also the biological impact of quarrying activities, considering that not all species are able to recolonize quarries after use. Next slide, please, John. So here, this example attempts to avoid the usually changed vegetation after a quarry's use. So what happened here was that seeds, plantations, and cuttings were taken from the area before quarrying began and stored and maintained. Then once quarrying had completed, these plants and cuttings and seeds were replanted afterwards in the restored area to avoid the risk of introducing alien species into the ground. Next slide, please, John. It's important for the restoration to ensure that it encompasses the complete ecosystem with all relevant process and components. It's important to understand that this quarry is a mosaic habitat, and all species must be used, especially those particular to the gypsum areas, and these generally tend to be the most vulnerable ones. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so we know that we can create disturbance and disruption through our quarrying activities, but it's also understood that these aren't always necessarily negative. The development of a gypsum quarry can create the favorable conditions that provide habitats for species demanding heat and light, such as orchids, gentians, and carnations. And because of the removal of tall growing vegetation, new soil conditions, and the different shapes of quarries, a wide variety of habitats can be obtained. Next slide, please, John. So I think in summary, I'd like to reiterate 3 key points. The first is that the European gypsum industry recognizes the importance of managing our quarries in an environmentally friendly manner. At the end of the day, it's difficult for a quarry owner to ask for a new mining permit if we're not able to demonstrate that we can manage our existing quarries effectively. So it's in our best interests to manage our quarries in an environmentally friendly manner. The second point I'd like to make is we have the capability to achieve this. I've shown 3 very good examples of 3 gypsum quarries throughout Europe this afternoon, very briefly. But we have many, many more examples, and we have the capability to be able to prove this. And thirdly, I think, and probably most importantly, that the success of these projects is really only achieved by close cooperation and collaboration between the authorities, economic and civil stakeholders. And I think that's key to all our endeavors in managing biodiversity in our quarries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave, for this brief overview of some examples. So I'd like to take a few questions from the audience now, and again, ask those who haven't submitted questions to do that. They will be welcome. So I've seen a first question targeted at you, Professor Mai. How do you see the link between applied quarry biodiversity management and external communication? Is there a need for external third-party verification of data or certification of the management system? Gregory, can you take this one?
I think that any management system that answers legal aspect needs a certification. It's exactly the same thing than when you are measuring the quality of air or water. You have certified measurement tools and certified procedure. But also it seems that it's a request from the sector because biodiversity sometimes I would say a topic of expert where you need to distinguish a toad from another toad or dragonfly from another dragonfly. And if you miss the protected ones, you can have problem, even if you have good intention and you want to do best thing for communication. It's important. And from the life in quarries, we learned that the sector requests an external certification of the process at a regular interval, at least each 3-5 years, an expertise to be sure that everything is okay, that the management plan is on the good way, and that the monitoring is okay.
Thank you. I've seen another question to you, Przemysław. The data on the status of biodiversity from member states, where are they available in a public database?
Yes, all the data is collected by the European Environment Agency, and you can access data per member state. So you can see what is the conservation status of all the habitats and species that occur in these member states. You can see what sort of threats and pressures they are affected by. And of course, you can also see data aggregated at the EU level.
Okay, thank you. And I've seen you've provided a link via the chat, so we could share that as well. While some other people may send some questions, I have a few more on my end. Maria, what can the EU do about the question of public acceptance of mining quarrying projects? What is the role? What can the Commission help doing?
Well, the bit I mentioned at the end, the statement that was made at European Battery Alliance Ministerial meeting 12th of March drew attention to this. I mean, this is something that we also pointed at in the critical raw materials communication and action plan, that it is indeed a challenge for the for sourcing in the EU. And it is, I think that we should see this initiative on setting up these EU principles for sustainable raw materials. It is one contribution to this area in trying to improve, to be a kind of tool that can be used to improve communication with different stakeholders and with communities concerned by extractive projects. So this is one contribution. It may be of limited. I mean, it is not, well, I'm aware of the, let's say, we should have realistic expectations to it, but we definitely acknowledge the importance of strengthening the dialogue with the communities and the stakeholders concerned. And this is also linked to the permitting processes that at times and in certain places can be quite lengthy and somewhat lacking of predictability. So these are areas where increased efforts will continue to be needed also as we go along.
Thank you, Maria. A question we've heard from Przemysław about the importance of having protected areas and the challenge in the light of the challenges on biodiversity. Professor Mahi, to what extent are extractive activities compatible with all ecosystems from your experience?
Unmute.
You're on mute. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in this way, I had time to prepare my answer, being politically correct. So obviously, there are some ecosystems that are very difficult to restore with high biological value, such as pristine forest and peatlands, as I said. But I think it's always a matter of context and on accumulation of impact. So we need protected areas. It has been underlined by the European Commission, and we need to reinforce the protection in part of the protected area on surface in Europe. But anyway, everywhere, it's always a problem of accumulation of impact that should be evaluated in any human disturbance, and specifically in extractive disturbance that will modify the ecosystem, and some ecosystems are very difficult to restore.
Okay, thank you for this answer. Dave, a question for you. Could you quickly explain what you referred to as the temporary nature in quarries? What are we talking about?
Yes, this is a concept that has come up recently, where people are exploring the idea that where a quarry owner might be granted permission to mine a particular gypsum body on the basis that temporary habitats are created within the quarry, and it's understood at the time that these are temporary. What they do is they allow for the migration of species to the quarry, or it could be that the species colonize the temporary areas in the quarry, but it's understood that they are temporary in nature. So it's an agreement, I guess, if you like, between the quarry owner and the authorities to maintain some biodiversity while the quarry is in operation.
Thank you, Dave. I'm looking at the clock. I'm seeing that we have slightly passed already our hour. So maybe a very final question, as I can't see any else in the chat.
Przemysław seems to have something. He's raising his hand, I think, no?
Oh, did you? Przemysław, please do.
Yes, I would like to maybe add a little bit to what Maria said in relation to your question about acceptance of mining activities. I think it's very important, at least when it comes to mining in protected areas, to know exactly what we have in these protected areas, and what we want to protect, and what kind of objectives for protection we want to establish. Because, for example, when it comes to the Natural 2000 network, we don't protect essentially everything at the same level. We want to know exactly what kind of conservation objectives we need to have for specific habitats and species, what kind of condition they are at the moment, what kind of state we want them to be in, and this should be translated into specific parameters and attributes. For example, how many hectares of a certain habitat you want to have in this area, and then it might turn out that the mining activity is not even necessarily damaging this area. So I would definitely invite the mining sector to work hand in hand with the environmental authorities to exactly establish this kind of site-specific conservation objectives, because it can then facilitate the impact assessment of the projects and the operation of the projects.
Thank you, Przemysław. In the meantime, we have just received a question from the audience. How much time after the start of the restoration operation can we consider our restoration is not acceptable? Who would like to take this question? Professor Mahi or Dave, maybe?
It depends on the habitat.
Mm-hmm.
When we began ecological restoration 20 years ago with dry grasslands, it was most ecologists think that it was impossible to restore dry grassland, high biodiverse dry grassland, and the experience shows us that it is possible. It is possible in some time lapse of 10 years when you just apply the adequate methods. But if you want to restore a natural forest, it will take probably centuries. to reach the higher level of biodiversity. We agree, not to restore your pre-human forest, pre-exploitation human forest. We agree. So it depends on the habitat. And one important challenge, I think, for the acceptance of mining in relation to biodiversity is to secure funding for the rehabilitation and for biodiversity management. Currently, there is a huge amount of fundings of money that is available for classical rehabilitation, for example, making again intensive forestry, intensive agriculture. We can change the objective, we can change the target of those fundings and secure those funding for biodiversity, because the lifetime of a quarry is long, and also, as we said, for some habitat restoration may be a long process. So we need to secure funding at the very first beginning of the process of extraction development, and I think it will increase the acceptance by the society.
From my perspective, Tristan, I guess we don't have any option with legacy quarries because you know they're part of the past. But I think with any new quarry that we're looking at or recent development, one of the key things that the developer should be engaging with the local authorities on is what are the key performance indicators that they require once restoration is started and throughout the restoration period, to basically agree what the key performance indicators for biodiversity restoration are.
Thank you, Dave, as well. A very final question that got, because we have passed the time. Climate change often disturbs Natura 2000 protection goals, forest types. Is this area open for developing climate stable biotopes by quarrying and restoration? Who could take that one? Przemysław, maybe?
I'm not fully sure if I fully understand the question. Obviously, climate change is one of the biggest threats and pressures to our biodiversity. And when we manage our Natura 2000 sites, we not only have to manage them in terms of the current climatic conditions, but we also have to anticipate what will happen in future in terms of the increase of temperature, in terms of the changes of precipitation, and the ecological conditions that it might affect. So the fact that an area is degraded right now doesn't mean that it can be abandoned and that it can be declassified and it's fully open to economic operations. Sometimes this kind of area will have to be restored, or maybe it will will have to be set aside for some other habitats developing there. So I think it all depends on the local situation and on this conservation objectives, so that I stressed in my previous interventions, to essentially decide what we want to protect and how we want to get there.
Thank you, Przemysław. Yeah, I'm afraid we will now have to close our webinar as the hour has really passed. But first, I'd like to thank very much our speakers for very interesting presentations, a great exchange of thoughts and experience on biodiversity and material supply and quarries. Many thanks to all participants for your active involvement and questions. I hope you enjoyed the discussions as much as I did. And before closing completely our webinar, I should recall that the video will be made available shortly on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find out on our website, eurogypsum.org. And I'd also invite you to look at our new interactive map with examples of biodiversity in gypsum quarries, also available on our website. I look forward to welcoming many of you again at future Eurogypsum webinars. And next one, we'll look at circularity in construction. So stay tuned. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks also to the technical team, Anita, John, and Duncan, and everyone. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Come on.
Thanks,
Bye.
Tristan. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.